American Trust Company, banking since 1854, as a public service to the many communities served by its banking offices throughout Northern California, takes pleasure in bringing you another program in the award-winning television series, Science in Action. Science in Action is produced by the West's oldest scientific institution, the California Academy of Sciences. Science in Action is brought to you by American Trust Company, which last year celebrated 100 years of banking. American Trust Company, banking since 1854, now invite you to join your host for the evening, Dr. Earl S. Harold.
I think all of us have had the experience of taking an imaginary trip. There are several ways you can do it. Spin the globe and stop it at some point, or perhaps do this with your finger and then close your eyes and, outer Mongolia. Actually, of course, it's much easier than that today by means of television. So let's go on one of these armchair tours and go to the highest part of the South American Andes on an Andes expedition across this great mountain range and see what we can find in the tropical forests on the far side. Now, as our guest and as our guide on this armchair tour, we're privileged to have with us Dr. Edward S. Ross, who has just returned from an 8-month trip into that region, doing some very important work. Dr. Ross, of course, is the entomologist at the Academy. Ed, how does it feel to be back once again?
Well, my feelings are always a bit mixed. I hate to come back, but yet I like to see the things I've caught in the net or on film in my camera.
Now, as I remember, your 1950-51 trip covered this region here. Now, where did you go on this trip?
Well, this time we more or less continued where we left off last time. We spent most of our time in the forests on the east slope of the Andes here, and then we recrossed the Andes and went up the Peruvian coast and up through Ecuador and Colombia, where we ended our trip.
That must have been a rather exciting experience to get down into these headwater areas where the giant Amazon pulls most of its water.
Yes, we are very anxious to get into this tributary region because there's so many interesting insects there that I wanted to photograph. And with these modern tools, the single lens reflex camera with the extension tubes to magnify the image and the electronic flash units, I was able to take pictures in the dim light of the forest where I might not have otherwise been able to work.
Well, I know that you took thousands of pictures, black and whites, and also color, but what are you planning to do with these now? How will you use them?
Well, as illustrations for books and magazine articles, textbooks, and most of all as visual aids in the classrooms around the country. The John Simon Guggenheim Foundation was very gracious to sponsor this work in photography.
Well, if your pictures are only half as good as your bestseller, Insects Close Up, that came out not so long ago, I know that you'll really have some fantastic results. But now, Ed, you mentioned quite often we in regards to this trip. Now, who do you include in we?
Well, we wanted to do more than just photograph the insects. We wanted to collect a few, and so we took along Mr. E.I. Schlinger, a graduate student at the University of California who functioned as insect collector. And he did very well because he came back with more than 150,000 specimens for our museum.
150,000, that's going to take a long time to work those up. Of course, it's quite valuable to have collections of that type, not only for students, but also for advanced scientists.
Yes, it is, and now I'd like to introduce the third and pretty important member of our party, Mrs. Ross, who always likes to go along on these trips.
Well, Ed, before we meet your wife, I'd like to say that she, of course, has her training in botany, and I know that she not only served as your cook, but also collected a lot of very valuable material. Mrs. Wilda Ross, of course, is an important asset in your work. And just let me ask her a few things here. Now, Wilda, tell me, how did you like it, roughing in the Andes?
Well, I enjoyed it very much. When we were in Tingo María, we had a very comfortable place to live.
But you did do a lot of camping out.
Yes, we did. On our 3-month trip into Colombia, we camped out most of the time.
Did you need any special equipment? Now, I recognize the type of equipment that most of us would use here in this country, but did you have any special things?
Well, no. As you see here, these are the things that we took along, and they're very ordinary. We had this umbrella tent with a zippered door, which was a very important thing to have. One night, just after we'd got in bed, a mountain lion looked in on us.
Well, I think that's probably the first time a mosquito net, instead of stopping a mosquito, it stopped the mountain lion. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and that is in regard to such things as canned food and food prices. Now, how are they down there? About the same we find in the United States?
Pretty much. In Peru, they're a little less, and in Ecuador and Colombia, they're probably a little more than ours here.
And did you use canned foods or did you use native foods?
We use some canned food, but we like to sample the native foods.
Well, there's one thing that interests me a great deal, and that is this stove that you have here. That's a very small stove. Now, did you do all your cooking on that for 3 people? It seems quite small for that.
Uh-huh. Well, we had a 2-burner stove, which we never unpacked, but we just always used this and put all of our dinner in one pot.
Well, that's a very easy way of doing it. Well, I'd like to ask Ed at this point just how you manage your transportation. What did you do in regard to that, Ed?
Well, it was quite simple. We looked in the want ad section of the paper and found an old used half-ton panel truck and bought it, put our stuff in it, and one fine morning it was hoisted aboard a Grace Line freighter bound for Callao, the port of Lima. Here we are sailing out the Golden Gate.
Well, now, you had, what was a newspaper truck, wasn't it?
Yes.
That you modified and revamped.
Yes, needless to say, we had it all fixed up, new tires and so forth.
Well, now, I've seen various things like this before, as, for example, one time I almost, in fact, I did lose some of my equipment in a sling like this, but you didn't have any trouble with your truck.
Yes, we were very fortunate to land on all 4 wheels. After a few days of preparation in Lima, we were very anxious to cross the mountains, and in doing so, we had to climb a very high pass.
It looks pretty chilly there. Let's see, are there some glaciers in the background there?
Yes, not only chilly, but also breathless, because the altitude was over 16,000 feet, and certainly no place for a person with a bad heart.
Ed, is it true that that is one of the highest roads in the entire world?
Well, I've been told that. I'm not sure. The other thing about this point was of interest is that it was the divide where the rivers began to flow east into the mighty Amazon system. After crossing a bit of the high country and seeing llamas and Altiplano Indians and old gray mining towns, we finally made our way down one of these Amazon tributary canyons and arrived at our base, Tingo María, which was right in the midst of a nice forested region.
That must have been an exceptional contrast. You have deserts and things of that nature in here, and then over into here into this lush jungle area.
Yes, it was a great contrast, and I'd like to show you some of the reasons why these contrasts occur. Here's a profile of the Andes, and the Pacific Ocean represented here is unusually cold in spite of these tropical latitudes because of the Antarctic Humboldt Current. Now, over the ocean at this point, there hangs a fog bank, which, when it crosses over onto the warm land, loses its capacity to hold water, and thus no rains fall.
You do get a fine drizzle there. What is it? You told me the name of that earlier. What is it, lomas?
Well, it calls a loma flora there during the winter months. You see, the air over the land is cool enough to cause a precipitation of this fog, and it occurs between 2,000 and 4,000 foot elevation on the seaward slopes. Above and below this zone, everything is very dry, like the mountains of the moon, and about the only thing you see are these bromeliads, or air plants, which are related to the common pineapple.
Well, if I remember my geography correctly, the only place that you find habitations or towns along here would be on these river valleys that extend down from the top, bringing moisture and water, of course, from the higher elevation.
Yes, these rivers are fed by the few rains that do fall over on the west side of the Andes, but for the most part, the Andes act very much like a great wall or barrier blocking these trade winds that come in from the southeast. These trade winds cause the heavy downpours that we associate with the tropics, and where the clouds form up against the mountains, you get the heaviest rains of all, and the heaviest forests, which we call, or is known as down there, is the montaña.
I guess then the mighty Amazon pulls most of its water from this area in this direction toward the Atlantic.
That's right. And it was in this montane area that we were most interested in working because the plant and animal life there, especially the insects, is some of the most profuse in the world. And our base, Tingo María, happened to be right in the midst of all that wonderful country.
Well, I'm quite anxious to see some of these pictures that you have taken, Ed, but first I'd like to go back and ask Mrs. Ross a few things about this high mountain area, especially in regards to this jungle arrangement. Now, this is something really quite striking, isn't it?
Yes, the jungle from the air is very interesting. It's like a sea of green with an occasional tree in bloom or a meandering river.
Well, I know that every biologist who has flown over the jungle canopy has wished he might be a bird flying around through here to be able better to inspect it.
Yes, this upper story of the jungle can be compared to the surface of the sea. There are constant daily changes in light, temperature, and air movement. And as we plunge down into the depths of the forest, the conditions are more constant.
It would seem to me that these trees in here would have a terrific challenge in trying to force their way up through this to get at the necessary sunlight.
Yes, there's great competition for sun. And so most of the jungle trees are shaped something like this, with a lot of leaves at the top and a long, narrow trunk.
No branches in between, but now this wide base, that again would be essential in anchoring the tree in the ground.
Yes, and oftentimes these jungle trees are entwined with vines, and if you cut one of them down, it remains standing because it's held up by the vines.
Well, that gives us a fairly good idea of what's involved in this jungle area. Suppose we ask Ed now if he'll show us some of his pictures. Ed, what is this first one that you have here? That's a very striking one.
First and foremost, in the thought of people that hear about our trips to the jungles, how about the snakes? Did you see many snakes? So I put in a rather enlarged picture of one of the harmless emerald tree boas that we saw. This snake is only 4 feet long, although it looms up pretty big here.
I just wish we had one that size. That's really a terrific photograph, Ed. Of course, when you start to look for these things, invariably, you can't find them, and it's only occasionally that you come across them.
Yes, you can go for days without seeing a snake because of the protective coloration of the snakes, the fact they live in the trees, and they scurry off ahead of you as you approach. But you do find many interesting frogs and toads in the forest, and this one here interested us very much because it was brilliant red marked with black, and it carried on its back a mass of tadpoles. This is really the father's burden. That's the male frog carrying the tadpoles back to a brook where they will be deposited when they're just the right age.
I believe I know that type of frog. That's one of the Dendrobates group. In fact, they have a poisonous secretion in the flesh, and sometimes the Indians use the venom to poison their arrow tips. In fact, they've been introduced in Honolulu in the Manoa Valley over there where they don't do any harm, of course.
Yeah, introduced by mistake,
yes.
I'll bet. Well, that bright red color probably has a lot to do with their protection from other animals. We also saw this giant toad. This is one of the largest toads in the world. It's about 1 foot long. Another thing we saw was a strange marsupial frog. Here it is taking a rest on an agave leaf.
Those bumps on the back, I suspect, would be the young frogs being carried about, embedded in the flesh there, of course. And so this fellow, much like the kangaroo, has the same sort of a habit. And from that, of course, he gets his name, marsupial frog.
There were a lot of other animals, of course, we saw, but many of them are used for pets. For example, here's a baby kinkajou that is very inquisitively looking at my camera, wondering whether it's good to eat.
Ed, what about the monkey situation down there? Did you find a number of them?
Oh, yes, you see the monkeys up in the trees as you wander about, but you also see a lot around the houses used as pets, and they can be purchased just like vegetables at the Indian markets.
If you
Yes.
want that, why, then that would be the ideal thing. This owl monkey that you had mentioned earlier was one of the very amazing little fellows. Those eyes, certainly large. I guess that's a night adaptation. Now, what about insects, Ed?
Well, of course, to me, words or even pictures fail to describe the fabulous array of insects that one sees on a jungle walk. One of your main impressions, I think, is the way insects of the forest manage to hide themselves from their things that eat them. Take, for example, this big katydid, which looks just like a leaf.
That's certainly a striking thing. Let's see, the venation extends down through the wing of the katydid. It looks so much like a leaf, it's very difficult to make out there, isn't it?
Yeah, the katydids are really endless in variety of form. Just look at this one right here. It's a big spiny job with a jagged outline and a variegated pattern. You could easily imagine how that thing would blend into the mottled background of lights and shadows in the forest.
Certainly a spectacular insect and a spectacular picture, but what about this matter of concealment now? Of course, many insects need that. They have to be concealed from their predators. Do you have any examples of that?
Well, how do you like this? Here are two insects sitting on a leaf. They're katydids again. Certainly beautiful examples of protective.
The legs are going forward there, and they're very, very difficult to make out. Well, that is a good example of camouflage, but now what about this matter of the opposite thing of mimicry, where an insect resembles something else to its own advantage?
Well, the background's part of the environment, so are the living things. Just look at this moth here. It looks just like a wasp, not only wasp-like in form, but in color, yellow and the black pattern. And everything you look at, you have to look at twice. Like, well, for example, an ant might turn out to actually be a spider. This is a spider, believe it or not.
That's a spider?
Yes, it moves and acts just like an ant.
Well, I know you had some experience with the very famous leaf-cutting ants. How did you find them when you were working with them?
Well, you couldn't help but find them because every place you looked, like, say, this mass of cacao leaves, you see busily. The ants are busy at work carrying off the whole tree piece by piece. If you look closer at these operators, you'll find they cut on the dotted line, neat circular hemispheres or semicircular pieces of leaves which they carry in their jaws and down into subterranean galleries and hideaways where they grow special fungus on the compost formed by the rotting leaf pieces.
Well, in other words, then they don't necessarily have an interest in the leaf material, but rather in the fungus growing on the leaf.
That's right.
You know, I used to collect bugs years ago, and one thing I was interested in were the beetles, but I have never heard of any beetles such as you were able to record here.
Yeah, this is a very strange sight. It's hanging on the underside of a log. It's a mass of beetle larvae or grubs which got together and then hung down on gelatinous threads and went into the cocoon or pupa stage. Mm-hmm. And looks like a bunch of pendulums all together.
I think I see some of the beetles on the bottom there. They're probably in the act of emerging.
Another thing one sees along jungle trails are many interesting bees. This long-tongued bee we have here, I think, is about as striking a thing. It's brilliant emerald green with this great arcing tongue. Normally a tongue like that's used for sucking nectar out of deep jungle flowers, but you could see it can be also used for lapping fluids off of a leaf.
Well, now, butterflies have a proboscis somewhat like that, but is there any similarity actually in it?
Well, in function it's similar, but in carrying, the bee doesn't coil its tongue, but carries it in a long straight line underneath its belly, whereas a butterfly coils the tongue like a watch spring. And here I think I have a picture showing one of these butterfly tongues uncoiled, and the butterfly's in the act of lapping up moisture from a jungle puddle.
Well, I've often seen masses of butterflies doing that very thing along muddy trails, but one thing I'd like to ask you about now, while we're on the subject, you were there at Tingo María. Did you have an opportunity to get into those caves, and what were you able to find out when you got in there as regards these very famous
just look around and you'll see you're in the cave. This is a picture of one of these famous oilbird caves, and we wouldn't have missed the experience of going into it for anything. It has the usual stalagmites and everything, but the sound is the unusual thing. If you listen, you'd hear this strange squawking and squealing coming out of this dark depths, and certainly an eerie sound, very much like a haunted house or something.
You know, I'll wager that if you had not known what was in that cave and heard that sound, you probably wouldn't have gone inside.
Well, I'd done a little reading, and I expected that the noise was made by hundreds of oil birds. Here's one sitting on her nest with the babies and the eggs. It's a very strange bird that nests back in the ledges in the dark depths of the cave.
Well, coming back to that noise that they make once more, that is used somewhat in the way that bats would use their noise, I presume. And
Yes, they bounce the sound off the walls of the cave. It's sort of a sonar effect. This bird in flight is actually chirping, clicking to make this sonar effect.
That's a very beautiful photograph. How did you take that?
Well, my friend, Mr. Schlinger, crawled into the cave with me and held a 18-foot bamboo pole with a strobe light on the end of it while I plunked away with my telephoto lens and using the light of a Coleman lantern to focus by.
Well, that must have been a pretty lucky photograph, then.
Yeah, only every now and then do you get a shot that's in focus.
Well, now you have nesting birds, and you have all this variety of birds that you find in here, but why are they called oil birds? I noticed this nesting one here. That is a very beautiful demonstration also.
Yes, unfortunately, the natives have a habit of going in these caves during the nesting season, and using long poles, they'll scrape off the young nestlings and gather them up and boil them and use them for oil, and hence the name oil bird.
Oh, I see. You were mentioning earlier this material that's in the bottom of the cave. Now,
well, the material in the bottom of the cave is a mass of palm seeds. The birds go out at night and gather these palm seeds and digest the meat off of them, and then they cough up the seeds of various kinds of palms, and so you literally walk in knee-deep in old palm seeds, which are very interesting to us because they're the homes of many insects. You can see little holes where the insects have emerged.
Sounds to me as though you must have had a bug hunter's paradise, not only in this, but in all the other things that you did. And Dr. Ross, I want to thank you once again for coming to Science in Action to tell us about these things, and of course to you, Mrs. Ross, for all the help that you gave Ed during the trip. Our thanks to you also. I'll be back in just a moment with the Animal of the Week. First, however, let's step over and join our friend Jay Jacobus.